Laskin Corla, delighted to have an opportunity to speak on this very important issue, and I want to welcome the members of the Justice for the Forgotten who are here in the House again this evening, and to pay tribute to their long and arduous campaign seeking justice in very difficult circumstances. Laskin Corla, yesterday Justice for the Forgotten marked the 37th anniversary of the Dublin Monaghan bombings with the Reed Lane ceremony in Talbot Street, which was the scene of the worst loyalist bombings in Ireland. The same day, the Queen of England laid a wreath in the Garden of Remembrance to honour those Irish men and women who died in 1916 rebelling against the Crown. It was indeed a unique moment. The Good Friday Agreement and the growing relationship between Britain and Ireland makes now the ideal time to seek to close the gap of grief and pain on the worst atrocities committed on the island of Ireland in recent times. It is time for the Government of the United Kingdom to agree to the repeated requests of this House, as expressed today in the words of the Dáil motion, and I quote, to allow access by an independent international judicial figure to all original documents held by the British Government relating to the atrocities that occurred in this jurisdiction and which were inquired into by Judge Barron for the purpose of assessing said documents with the aim of assisting in the solution of these crimes. End of quote. I was Labour Party spokesperson on justice and a member of the Joint Oireachtas Justice Committee, which conducted the public hearings and drew up the reports on Judge Barron's investigations into the Dublin bombings of 1972 and 1973, and the Dublin and Monaghan bombings of 1974, the bombing of Case Tavern, Dundalk in 1975, and the murder of Seamus Ludlow in 1976. The testimony and witness of the surviving victims and relatives was the most poignant and compelling part of our deliberations. Few members of the subcommittee were left unmoved by the experience. The sense of loss and pain for their loved ones, which they experienced 30 years and more after the tragic events, was compounded by the insensitive way that many of them were treated by the agents and the agencies of this state, and by the total failure of the state and successive governments to vindicate their rights as citizens under the Constitution. They were truly the forgotten victims. I remember well the early days of the campaign by the appropriately named Justice for the Forgotten. They were treated with the gravest of suspicion by the authorities and subjected to close attention and harsh treatment by the special branch. They and those who supported them were regarded as pariahs and even subversives. The late Tony Gregory and myself were the only public representatives to support the campaign for many years. Now there is full support amongst public representatives of every political hue in the Oireachtas. It is a rare expression of unanimity, and it must be built on. I welcome the fruitful meeting which took place last week between the Taoiseach and Minister for Foreign Affairs Eamon Gilmore and the delegation from the Justice for the Forgotten. I welcome the commitment made in the House yesterday by the Taoiseach and reiterated by the Minister for Justice that the request for full disclosure of documents would be raised by the Taoiseach with the British Prime Minister David Cameron. Let us be under no illusion that access to the tens of thousands of documents which were denied to Justice Barron will be easy. They contain the most highly sensitive classified information relating to a dirty war which spilled over into the Republic with tragic results. Last month, when the Taoiseach and Minister for Foreign Affairs Eamon Gilmore raised the matter with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Owen Paterson, he was told that the British Government was not in a position to accede to the request to disclose the content of the files. Speaking in Morning Ireland today, the British Foreign Secretary William Hague sounded more intent on raising difficulties than exploring ways forward. However, he did not close the door entirely to the relevant files being released by the British Government. In its fourth and final report in 2007, the Justice Subcommittee made its most damning finding. Quote, the subcommittee is left in no doubt that collusion between the British security forces and terrorists was behind many, if not all, of the atrocities that are considered in this report. We are horrified that persons who are employed by the British administration to preserve peace and to protect people were engaged in the creation of violence and the butchering of innocent victims. The subcommittee is of the view that given that we are dealing with acts of international terrorism that were colluded in by the British security forces, the British government cannot legitimately refuse to cooperate with investigations and attempts to get to the truth." End of quote. This is indeed a damning finding and raises the most serious questions for the British Government. In 2001, the British and Irish governments, meeting at Weston Park, agreed to appoint the distinguished Canadian judge Peter Corey to conduct an investigation into allegations of collusion by the security forces into 6 specific cases. These were the murders of solicitors Pat Finucane and Rosemary Nelson, the killing of Robert Hamill, Billy Wright, Lord Justice and Lady Gibson, and Chief Superintendent Harry Breen and Superintendent Bob Buchanan. The judge had the power to direct witnesses to attend for interview and the power to compel the delivery of all relevant documentation. Having considered all the confidential documentation, the judge would report to the government and recommend a public inquiry or other action as appropriate. And this he did. And in effect, the judge recommended a public inquiry into 4 of the 6 cases. The Irish government responded positively and established an inquiry into the 2 killings which took place along the border. The Smithwick Tribunal of Inquiry into the killing of 2 RUC officers, Breen and Buchanan, is in situ at the present time. Indeed, when the committee was making its final deliberations, members held a conference call with Judge Corey, who explained his role under the Weston Park Agreement and indicated his willingness to carry out a similar role if requested by the Irish and British governments in relation to the Dublin Monaghan bombings. There is clearly, therefore, a model for moving forward and dealing with the undisclosed files. The second part of the motion requests that the Barron report and the text of the Dáil resolution be communicated to the British House of Commons for consideration. I believe that it is important that the House of Commons be asked to consider and debate the atrocities which were carried out in the Republic in the 1970s. 3 years ago, the Barron reports were forwarded to the House of Commons, but were never debated there. Many of the British members of Parliament had adopted a hostile and negative attitude to the request and were dismissive of the Barron findings, despite the fact that the motion had been passed unanimously and had been referred by the Dáil, by the Clerk of the House, to the British House of Commons. Nevertheless, the findings raise serious questions for the British Government if the British forces in Northern Ireland were engaged in cross-border acts of aggression, culminating in bombings, shootings and killings against a friendly country. These issues cannot be ignored. Yesterday in the Dáil, the leader of Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams, stated that he was prepared to engage in a truth and reconciliation process in relation to the Northern Ireland conflict if an independent and international truth commission was established. I believe that this statement is to be welcomed. And finally, can I say that the Queen's visit to the Republic of Ireland may at last be the catalyst for bringing about closure to the most recent phase of the tragic history of our 2 islands, allowing all of the people to move on. But this government and the British government must act on it. Thank you.